Okay, so for me it is. What? Just chill. Wait, I'm in my bag further down. Hold on. Like that, see?
Yeah, that's better.
Comfy? Oh wait, I shouldn't be talking. I'm gonna mute the mic.
Is it streaming now?
This House believes that there is no longer a justification for the existence of NATO. I'm sorry we're starting slightly late, I'll just go through my usual announcement, but first, can we please have a big hand for the speakers you see right before you. It is exceptionally kind for each and every one of them tonight to let you know of their views and increase your knowledge of an interesting subject. So just like to thank them by doing that. What we do as a society is the next thing I'll talk about. We are the Debating Society. We run Monday public debates on a wide variety of issues. We recently have ones on TTIP, and we have ones coming up on Obama's legacy and the commercialization of the Pride rally. So there's lots of stuff to think about from any area, and I recommend everyone to come on Monday to 7, because you can always get some rewind, listen to some great conversation, and just experience an amazing event. The second thing that we regularly do is on Thursdays at 7, we have our training sessions. That's when the experienced debaters in society get together and teach people how to debate, and you practice how to debate on some interesting thing which our training officers have cooked up. Also, if you come on Thursdays, you can get to go through our trial system. You can potentially go to an intervarsity competition like the Warwick Intervarsity, which recently happened and we had great success at, or you can get the LSE Open, or like international competitions which have happened in Greece, in India. There's loads of opportunities you can get if you come to our regular events on Thursdays, which you do have to purchase membership to, so I recommend everyone here do that. One special thing which I'm announcing is that we hold our own InterVarsity competition too, the UCL InterVarsity, the UCLIB, and a lot of people are coming. A lot of people are coming internationally because it's a prestigious event. What we do is we help people to stay in London without paying the ridiculous prices I'm sure you're aware of by providing them with a place to crash for the night of the competition. We put up a little form on our website and in our emails if anyone wants to provide a home for 1 or 2 nights for a person who's come internationally or nationally to talk about interesting things. So it will be an interesting person, and you'll get free entry to our socials, which will have free booze. You'll be able to watch the final, which will be an excellent discussion of a very interesting issue. And I just recommend everyone to check out the crash form and write through it if you think you'd want to do something like that. It's great fun. That's what we do as a society. I'm next going to talk about what happens tonight, how it's going to work, so that everyone can follow everything that happens. But first, just remember we have wine at the front, you can see it there, and we have juice too, so if anyone is thirsty, please come up and get some. If you're thirsty in between, please remember to come up between speeches to respect our speakers who have, as I said, come tonight very kindly. Now the form. So each speaker you see before you will speak for 7 minutes. At 1 minute into this speech, my treasurer here will clap. At that point, any one of you can ask a short question. You do this by standing up and saying, on that point, or I have a question, or something like that. The speaker can say no to you, so don't feel offended if they do, but they can say yes. So I encourage everyone to offer questions if you have in your mind, but respect that. It's not a speech, it's a short little 10-second question. At 6 minutes into the speech, we'll get another clap, and then no more questions can be offered, and at 7 minutes in, we'll get 2 claps. I love the demonstrations, just to signify that everything is coming to an end. After we've had a proposition speech, an opposition one, and a second proposition opposition in that format, then we will go to you in the audience. We will have floor speeches. You can give a floor speech of 3 minutes or less in one of 3 positions. You can talk in proposition of this, saying that there is no longer a justification for the existence of NATO. You could be in opposition, saying there is a justification, or you can be in abstention, which means you're in the middle, means you're unpersuaded, means you can't fully endorse one position, means you just want to get something out without necessarily saying, I definitely believe this. So those are 3 things you can have. Think throughout the main speeches and cook up something interesting to add to the debate. People can always add something interesting. After those floor speeches, at which I would be reticent not to mention, you can win 1 or 2 prizes, either a box of chocolates or a bottle of port, which are right there. I'll just get them up here. So that's another reason to prepare something. Not just to interest people, but actually to get booze/chocolate, they're great. After the floor speeches, we'll have summary speeches. At that point, each of the sides you see before you, the proposition and the opposition, will have 4 minutes between them to summarise the debate as a whole as they've seen it. First, we'll go to the opposition side. Opposition will have 4 minutes to put forward the final arguments to keep it fresh in your mind before we vote at the end. And then we'll have the proposition summary speech to close the debate as a whole. So that's the format of the night. We'll have the main speeches, we will have the floor speeches, and we'll have the summary speeches. I just want to make something clear about the speeches. Please do not record any of the speakers. We have to ask for explicit permission in order to record the speakers' main speeches, but that's us. And unless you have asked all the speakers, please don't do that. Also, along with engaging through asking a point of information, a short question, or asking or giving a floor speech, you can also tweet. It'll be up on the screen in a second, a live Twitter feed, at which you can be on if you tweet with the hashtag UCLU Debating. We'll put the highlights up there. If anyone wants to get involved without necessarily giving a full thing by standing up and talking. I will now introduce our speakers one by one. Just let the speaker who just arrived come up to a position now. That's all right. Excellent. Okay, so again, all the speakers now here. So a combined round of applause for all the speakers again, please. Yeah, and I'd like to thank the volunteer who stepped up from the audience to fill the gap, which in the end didn't happen. But thank you, Dr. Neil Sands, also. We have some excellent speakers here tonight who have invited and have come down at great kindness. So I'd like to introduce each of them all as one, and then we'll get their speeches after I've gone through all of their introductions. So speaking first in proposition is Gilbert Achcar, who grew up in Lebanon, researched and taught in Beirut, Paris and Berlin, and has since been 2007 Professor of Development Studies and International Relations at SOAS, University of London. His many books include The Clash of Barbarisms, The Making of the New World Disorder, published in 13 languages, Perilous Power, The Middle East and US Foreign Policy, co-authored with Noam Chomsky, The Arabs in the Holocaust, The Arab-Israeli War of Narratives, and The People Want a Radical Exploration of the Arab Uprising. His next book, Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising, will come out in the spring. Please welcome him here tonight. And speaking first in opposition, we have John Lowe. John runs the Russian and CIS practice of Garber Strategies, a London-based public affairs and strategic consulting company. He's also an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, the foreign policy research establishment. From 2003 to 2008, he was an international affairs advisor at TNK-BP, Russia's third largest oil company. From 2001 to 2003, he was managing director of the PBN company's London office. He spent 6 years with NATO, 1985 to 2001, including a posting to Moscow where he set up NATO's information office. From 1989 to 1995, he was a senior lecturer at the Soviet Studies, later Conflict Studies, Research Center. He is an expert on the politics of the Russian oil and gas sector and Russia's relations with its neighbors and with NATO, and is regularly called upon in the media to provide expert comment on international affairs. Please welcome him here tonight. Speaking second in proposition, we have Dr. Anna McNeil. She is a senior visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and honorary university fellow at the Department of Politics, University of Exeter. She acts as a consultant to international organizations such as the UN, the EU, and the OSCE, international NGOs and donors such as DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK. Previously, she was a research fellow at Chatham House, worked at the London School of Economics, and headed programs at International Alert and Safe World. She was born in Moscow and lived and worked in London since 1991. Please welcome her here tonight. And our final speaker, the second opposition speaker, Dr. Samir Puri, a lecturer in international relations in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Prior to this, he has worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, 2009 to 15, where his assignments included counter-terrorism strategy and policy support to a number of peace processes. In 2014-15, he was seconded to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in East Ukraine to monitor the conflict. He began his career at RAND 2006 to 09, where he's authored studies on European and US defense policy. Dr. Puri earned his PhD at Cambridge University, and his doctoral thesis is currently being turned into a book entitled Confronting Armed Groups. This will be published by the International Institute of Strategic Studies in 2016. So please welcome him here tonight. And one final round of applause for our speakers after I have taken an initial vote tonight, because we need to know what the room thinks now so we can know how they've been persuaded later. So we can get my two volunteers up here and go through again the positions you can vote for. You can vote in proposition, you can vote in opposition, you can vote in abstention, which is neither, which is in the middle. So, first off, the motion is this House believes that there is no longer a justification for the existence of NATO. Who would like to vote in proposition to that motion? no longer a justification for the existence of NATO. Looks like we've got the numbers now. Who would like to vote in opposition to this motion? There is a justification for the existence of NATO. If we've got those two, who would like to vote in abstention on this issue? You don't know if there is justification for the existence of NATO. You haven't decided yet. You don't think it's possible to be other positions. Lots of reasons you might go abstention. Excellent. So with that done, with all of the preamble now previous amble, that's a really bad joke. You do that better. I'm sorry. We can now introduce the first speaker tonight. After a round of applause for all the speakers once more, please welcome them all the way back. And now, as I said, our first proposition speaker, Gilbert.
Thank you. Well, what was the justification of NATO? NATO was founded in 1949 as an anti-communist alliance, basically. It was founded against the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And as we all know, the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991. And before that, the Warsaw Pact, which was the communist equivalent counterpart of NATO, was also dissolved. So the basic justification of NATO disappeared with the end of the Soviet Union and the end of any kind of communist bookmarks threat to Western Europe. And yet, NATO was maintained, and that didn't come spontaneously. That was the result of vigorous debate.
That's just 1 minute.
At the very top of the country which dominates completely NATO, which is the United States of America, because basically NATO is completely under US hegemony, technically or politically, in most cases, literally or. And you had a very vigorous debate at the top of the US government in the Clinton administration, where it so happens that the Minister of Defense of that time was for a different kind of policy towards Russia, saying we have to integrate Russia in the Western system in the way we integrated Germany and Japan, defeated in the Second World War. So if we look at the Russia as coming out of a defeat in the Cold War, we ought to integrate Russia in our system and build a peaceful world in this respect. And the counter-argument was very much predicated on continuing to consider Russia, even though it was no longer communist or whatever, as a potential enemy. And why was it so? Because the United States needed to have an enemy to justify the continuation of the vassal-type relations they maintained with Western Europe and Japan. And actually, I mean, the justification of NATO had disappeared. If you needed a security organization for the area that NATO used to cover, you have the OSCE, which was mentioned, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which involves Russia. If you are speaking of a global security organization, we have one. It's called the United Nations. which has something called the Security Council, and which by international law is the only body which is able to legitimize war at the global level, at the international level. Only by international law, except self-defense war, only those which are approved by the UN Security Council are legal, unlike the occupation of Iraq that the country where we are participated in, which was an illegal war, and you know about disasters that led. It was a completely disastrous experience. So NATO basically had done its time. It was maintained, and not only maintained, turned into an active military tool of the United States involved in wars for the first time, because the paradox is that NATO never shot a single bullet during the whole Cold War and started getting in wars after that. And beyond that, the United States and its allies started expanding NATO into former Soviet influence area. They started with 3 countries in Eastern Europe, and then it progressively went into involving previous republics of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a federation republic, so we have the Baltic states and other joining NATO, and all that in a system which was antagonizing Russia to the point that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because this way of dealing with Russia led to the very natural reaction of the Russians developing nationalist feelings, developing the feeling that they are rejected by the Western system, that they are encircled militarily by the Western system, and behaving accordingly. And the maintenance of NATO, therefore, has made the war much less safe than what it ought to have been at the end of the Cold War, where there were so many expectations and hopes and beliefs in the peace dividend and in a peaceful world. All this was shattered by those kinds of policies and those wars which actually were even in breach. The first major war waged by NATO in 1991 against Kosovo was an illegal war, not approved by the UN Security Council, where we had, of course, Russian and Chinese opposition to that war. And it was a major turning point in antagonizing these 2 countries. If you have Vladimir Putin today, well, that's a major result of the kind of policy that Washington has been following towards Russia.
You have 1 minute left.
1 minute? Okay, so it was over. I said what I had to say.
Thank you a great deal for that very thoughtful, excellent speech. I'd like to now invite the first speaker of opposition to respond to it. Please welcome him here tonight.
Thank you very much. As a former NATO official, I probably won't surprise you by saying that I fundamentally disagree with that characterization of NATO's policies, in fact, the alleged effect it's had on Russia, and also Russia specialists. I have something to say about that. But 3 years at Moscow in the 1990s, representing hopefully NATO's best interests. But let me say at the outset, this is one of the myths, that NATO is just a US organization. Of course, the United States is a dominant ally in the alliance, but it is not the only alliance. There are 27 other countries. In my time, there were 15 others when I started. And I sat around so many debates at NATO, so many different discussions about issues where a consensus had to be reached. And I watched so many times how the US had to adjust its policy to fit in with what its allies wanted. And I'll give you a really very clear example of what happened in 2008, which is when the Bush administration was very keen for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. But the European allies, and particularly France and Germany, said no. So they fudged the issue. And the 2 countries were not given the so-called membership action time. So to claim that the US decides everything is all in the US's terms, I think is naive. It is wrong. As far as Russia is concerned, let me say that NATO is not the reason why Russia has turned into what it is today. The enlargement issue is, in my view, a complete red herring. The Russian leadership wants to go back to 19th century security arrangements in Europe because they fit with its political model at home. What the Russians would like to have is a system of spheres of influence where small countries answer to the big ones. Russia was in fact offered a chance to become a genuine partner of NATO in the 1990s, and this is something I worked on heavily at the time. But outside the one case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which the military operation began in 1996 to stabilize the country, there was precious little real cooperation. And the reason for that, I think, is that the Russians feared that by cooperating with NATO, they would legitimize the alliance's role in European security. They simply didn't want to do that. And what's happened is they've fallen back, if you like, into this muscle memory of conspiracy theories about what the West wants to do to Russia and encircle them with all these things. Yes, repeatedly.
What are the core values of NATO now compared to what they used to be?
The core values remain exactly the same, which is to secure the defence of its member states and to provide stability in the area of NATO's operations. So it's very, very clear. This is a collective defence organisation. So let me just be clear. How many people in this room have an insurance policy? Does anybody take out insurance? Yeah, quite a few people do, don't they? Why do you do that? You do that because you perceive risk. NATO is, if you like, an insurance policy against risk in the area of defence and security. It is cheap, what it is. It is highly stabilising. Until very recently, war in Europe had become inconceivable. And that is because the NATO member states have worked so effectively among themselves to resolve their differences, their historic differences in some cases. In fact, NATO, I would say, has been so effective after the Cold War in Europe that it downgraded its traditional defence capability. Remember, this is a unique forum that keeps the Europeans and the US engaged in a serious security dialogue. We wouldn't have had German unification happen the way it did without the NATO machine there in the background. And consensus decision-making, let me tell you, is highly effective in terms of problem solving. The Greeks and Turks would come to serious blows if it hadn't been for NATO, even during the bad years of the Cold War. So the Palmerston dictum may be correct if you really said it, but there are no permanent allies or enemies, there just are permanent interests. In the case of Britain, I think we have a permanent interest in maintaining, stabilising mechanism of this kind. Let me just say a couple of other things about what are going on at the moment. Why would we want to be talking about getting rid of NATO when we should in fact be strengthening again our collective defence capabilities? Russia is trying to break the European security system, and classic hard power is part of its capability that it's using for this purpose. The Russian military are back, and they're using, of course, an array of other instruments, everything from corruption to organised crime to assassination in London, financing extremist forces, disinformation, you name it. These things are going on. These are the tools of 21st century competition. But NATO is, in my view, a highly effective organisation for resisting these things. We may have to revise the key article, Article 5 of NATO, that an armed attack on one is an attack on all the member states. We're going to have to reinvest in defence. We need a new model of containing this sort of threat that we're facing from Russia. And above all, the Europeans need to demonstrate that they are prepared to step up to the plate. And here we have, I think, a big problem, and that is the problem of the patience of the United States. The pressure on Germany here is really crucial, given that it is the biggest, most powerful country in Europe, struggling with this foreign policy responsibility. Now, the folly of Brexit is, in my view, one thing, but do we want to play into the hands of Russia and others that want to reduce the strength of Western institutions? Why would you want to get rid of an organisation like this? There would simply be no strategic gain. Would it be more stabilising to have a Europe not backed in terms of defence and security by the United States? Would we really benefit from having malign Russian and other policies disrupting our institutions and our overall economic development? I simply don't buy that.
first opposition speaker for a deeply informative and interesting speech, and welcome our second proposition speaker to continue her side's arguments.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was late. I have to say that I disagree on the grounds that I would argue that NATO in its current form actually creates more security threats rather than actually resolve security problems. And I have three arguments. One is symbolic weight of it. We sometimes need also to think not only what NATO actually does, but what does it represent. And I would say NATO largely breaks the spirit in which Cold War has ended, the spirit of trying to make peace genuine, trying to actually make West values, not Western values, but universal values, and that spirit was betrayed. Historical opportunity to actually build peace in Europe has been lost. If we look at history back again, now that the archives have been opened, now we actually see that the promises to Soviet leadership have been done by the West. This process has never been actually made into agreements. But that's not probably the main point was that created a very bigger moral effect with Russia, which did not see itself as a West and didn't want to see the West as an enemy, but feeling humiliated and bitter, of course powerless, and at some point we have the self-fulfilling prophecy of Russia being pushed into the corner and eventually reacted to it with aggression. So those who were portraying Russia in that category would say that yes, that was so. Then also it gave a sense of false security to NATO aspirant countries, that it would solve their internal problems and problems with their neighbors. But that's not something which NATO actually considers that it would be done. How the Cold War should have ended and what should have been the fate of NATO, that NATO should have transcended into a bigger security empire, which would have included Russia, other states on their territory, that it would have created something which was a genuine collective security, security for all. And NATO, because NATO was there and people wanted to continue it, sometimes for totally bureaucratic reasons, at that time not really for security reasons, then it created that kind of symbolic, moral dilemma. Maybe even the change of name would have probably eased the situation as it was at the time. Then secondly, NATO as a tool for the war of choice, which I would argue outside of NATO's security chapter, because it actually says that it is something which is supposed to defend the members, not the neighbors of the members. And it is only reacts when the members come under attack. If we look initially in the 90s, NATO presented itself as a developmental organization, as something which is driving security sector reform, which actually, yes, countries of Eastern Europe or Soviet Union badly needed to reform their sector. So maybe it was good that there was that kind of agenda brought in by military action. But of course, that war in Serbia, in Kosovo, changed that completely. That was a war of choice. It has violated NATO's own Article 5. Actually, it went on a false promise, as it turned out later, of massive attack on civilians, that the facts on the ground eventually were that more civilians died in NATO strikes rather than from military action of the Washington troops. Then what NATO does, it actually transformed into a police function, for which I would say it was completely unsuitable. I worked in Kosovo, and I saw examples of Greek NATO troops guarding Christian church, and then Danish troops guarding the Greek troops. So police duties were probably needed, but NATO was not something which was in spirit with organization and command structure was actually the best suitable organization for that. So thirdly, that brings me to the point of NATO being ineffective. Yeah? And where we see NATO kind of real combat action is Afghanistan. And again, I can say also from personal experience of doing research in Afghanistan, yeah, I was interviewing a colonel of German troops who said, but why are you telling me the situation is getting worse? Attacks on German troops actually scaled down. I said, but listen, the attacks on German NGOs scaled down because NGOs actually go out and do stuff. German troops operate on German labor laws, which mean that they have to protect kind of their own soldiers, and they have to justify every death. Then you have problems of commitment, coordination, and you have also NATO allies, countries like Georgia, who send their troops to be trained. Everybody is doing their own thing. So the real hardcore fighting, as we see in Afghanistan, as we see in Iraq, in other places, is done by a coalition of the willing or by the countries themselves, French military operation in Mali, coalition troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq. That's not something which NATO is actually suited for. Then you have problems of commitment of individual governments change. They start having second thoughts, some of them start regretting getting there in the first instance. So, yes, so on that note, I would say that it is actually now the deterioration in relation to Russia, NATO talk and is quite risky.
I'd like to thank you for that excellent, very informative speech, and now yield the floor to the final speaker and the second speaker of opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think John has very eloquently extolled some of the virtues of NATO, so I'm going to spend my time countering some of the arguments delivered by our two esteemed participants to my left. I think that they are slightly guilty of misdirected anger. And I say that because let's all be on the same page here to make sure we understand what NATO is. NATO is a multilateral forum. That means the member states of which it comprises of bring their agendas to the table. Without NATO, would those member states still come to the same conclusions about the great geopolitical and security problems around the world? I think the answer is yes. There is even a misnomer in the description for this event, where it says, is the organization's actions justified? The organization itself doesn't really set the policy agenda. It's funded by member states. The uniform generals who sit in Brussels are the generals of the countries of which NATO sends in money, sends in participants later on. On that point, there is a phrase, if you're in the NRA, you might say, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Multilateral forums themselves don't march on and set policy agendas in invade countries. So, the abolition of NATO, our two speakers for the proposition have fixated on the end of the Cold War. Now, I suspect most of you weren't born then. I certainly wasn't interested in geopolitics. I was more interested in Gary Lineker. 1991 is a long time ago. History doesn't work by pressing the reset button. If we were having this debate in 1991, there would be some virtue to the arguments they bring forward. In actuality, What's happened is that NATO has come to occupy a position of enshrining the transatlantic relationship in permanence. Was it to be abolished? Were it to be abolished, that transatlantic relationship would continue to persist anyway. It would be replaced by a series of bilateral relationships in which the US and the UK and France and so on and so forth would seek to replicate some of the facilities NATO already provides, but to do so independently of NATO. I also think it's important for us to not take for granted some of the advancements in stability and security that we do have. Something that should be apparent to all of us is that the frequency of wars between countries has dropped off from the lowest level in at least a couple of centuries, as long as we've had the modern sovereign state system. There are lots of conflicts going on. There are lots of civil wars, there are lots of proxy wars, that is definitely the case. But think about the role of alliances in actually making war between countries obsolete as a policy choice. A country like Russia, for example, has to effectively engage in subversion, engage in supporting proxies. The annexation cannot really be accomplished through overt military action. Yeah.
But what about the fact that NATO's like botched quite a lot of this intervention, such as the one in Kosovo?
Okay, well, let's actually focus on Afghanistan and Libya, because those are two much more current examples. I think, again, it's impossible to imagine the Americans would have moved into Afghanistan in 2001 with or without NATO. Once again, with regards to Libya, it's the American administration that pushed the intervention into Libya. There is something in diplomacy called forum shopping. What that means is when a policy decision has been made, the next decision is to look at which forum, UN, OSCE, EU, NATO, offers the best, most practical vehicle through which this particular policy can be realised. To remove NATO from the equation effectively removes one of those options for action. It doesn't necessarily change the commitments of member states to actually take those actions and how well they resource them and how well they actually plan them. Yes, sir?
If people feel they can go and talk to NATO more easily about policies which are antagonistic to specific countries, would it not be better to remove that forum?
That's not the only reason NATO exists, and I would ask you whether, if NATO ceased existing, whether those conversations would also cease existing as well. Again, I go back to that analogy about, well, do guns kill people, or do people kill people? Apply that again to this as a forum. Now, I do want to talk about Russia, because unlike, I think, people to my left, I have actually been killed by the Russian-backed separatists in East Ukraine. And I say that only because the level of offensive action that Russia has taken by operating below the sort of over radar of interstate warfare is actually quite astonishing. It's astonishing in terms of how much Russia has been able to get away with and how relatively powerless other countries have been to try to stop Russia. I do want to extol the virtues of strengthening NATO in light of the fact that the Russians are in a position in which they are taking what they can get when they see it as low-hanging fruit, and they are taking what they can get when they don't fear that there's going to be any kind of repercussion whatsoever with regards to the offensive actions that they're taking. If you took NATO away, there is no guarantee that the EU, for example, will start to work better as a common security forum. There is absolutely no guarantee that the OSCE can fill the void either. The gentleman to my left, I think, mentioned the OSCE, with whom I worked. It is not a military alliance. But I do want to say that NATO needs to be thought of in the context of all of these other multilateral structures, because NATO does something quite unique. NATO pulls the military forces of Western countries together. The OSCE does something quite different. It's a diplomatic forum in which the Russians and the West can engage. It would be wonderful if within our lifetime, within the next 20, 30, 40 years, the rationale for NATO with regards to the stance it needs to present against Russia starts to recede. This would be a very gradual thing. I interpret the question, by the way, as being asked in the specific context of 2016, not the specific context of 1991. In the context of 2016, it is actually quite absurd to think about abolishing NATO. It is better to think about owning NATO so that it can do its job more effectively in this day and age, and thinking about what NATO brings in a complementary fashion to the other multilateral structures, some of which are far more suited to encouraging cooperative dialogue with the Russians in the decades to come, which is an important factor. It's not simply about trying to scare the Russians away, it's about making sure that that low-hanging fruit, that sense that Putin can act with impunity, is something that is not allowed to persist. On that note, I will pause today. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our second opposition speaker there for an excellent speech, and all the main speeches for being excellent speakers. Now, as I said, we come to the time for the floor speeches. First off, there is still quite a lot of wine at the front. If you are like me and you want to loosen your tongue and inflame your spirits, come get some. Or you can have the juice and get a bit of sugar high. It's great. Okay, but please be quick, because we're going to get to the floor speech stage. Again, floor speeches happen at 3 minutes. We'll do it the same way we did the main speeches. At 30 seconds in, we'll bang once, and then questions will be asked. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, we will again bang once, at which point questions can no longer be asked. And at 3 minutes in, we'll bang twice, a signal like the time is up. If you just have a short point to make and you don't think you can stretch it out that long, it doesn't matter. It's great to hear stuff, no matter how much of it you have in you. Again, there are 3 positions you can take on it. You can give a proposition floor speech, you can give an opposition floor speech, or you can give an abstention floor speech. I hope you will give one, because I have some thoughts and I have some chocolates to get rid of, and I want someone to win them with a really great speech. So we can get everyone back into their seats. Then I'd like to ask if anyone in the room has in them a proposition floor speech. Put your hand in the air if you want to argue there is no longer a justification for the existence of NATO. Does anyone want to give a short little statement for the proposition in this debate? Doesn't have to be 3 minutes, can be a lot shorter. Maybe there's one over there on my left. If you'd like to come up, sir. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. Just a few words, because I think also it's important to keep in mind the full sense of what argument. And of course, if I benefited from NATO, if I worked for NATO, I would of course also defend NATO in any way possible. But somehow it's also a little bit like asking the wood where the sheep come from. Would you trust the wood? One thing I think is quite important to bring to attention is who actually controls NATO, and I think there were some misconceptions here that it's fairly democratic. I mean, there's no way, no doubt about the control of NATO. No, NATO is run by the United States.